Audit programs and fraud. When we take a look at various audit programs, an audit program was step-by-step procedures performed in order to audit an IT system. This would include auditing the actual function of the system, in other words, the information technology function, or what the system does, but will also include then the security of that system, to ensure that we've provided the correct levels of confidentiality or protection from disclosure of sensitive information, integrity both of the accuracy of the data and the integrity of the process so the system operates correctly, as well as availability, ensuring the system and the data are there when needed, that the system can support critical business needs. When we audit, we'll also ensure that we have quality processes that will work in a consistent, reliable, and effective manner. When we talk about effectiveness, we bring in areas such as cost-benefit to ensure that the controls we've put in place are providing the correct level of benefit or even expected level of benefit, but in a cost-effective manner as well. This brings in the area of efficiency. Efficiency means that our systems will operate now in a way that minimizes the use of resources and therefore will provide a minimum level of impact on performance, productivity, and other things such as resource usage, CPU usage, network usage, memory usage, and so on. It is also important as an auditor, when we examine and audit an information system, we are executing our fiduciary responsibilities, our responsibilities as a manager, as a protector of assets. For example, if I've been entrusted with the data of a customer, it's my fiduciary responsibility to ensure that that customer's data has been protected. If I'm required to be compliant with legislation or regulations, it's my fiduciary responsibility to ensure that I am adhering to and can demonstrate that level of compliance. Compliance means that we have met not only the requirements specified in the various regulations, but that we have the ability to demonstrate how we have taken steps to meet those responsibilities in a reliable and consistent manner. We'll also examine then the services that our systems provide. Do they provide the services and functions needed by the users and by our customers? As well as we will check to ensure that our systems are able then to provide what the business needs in a way to ensure that those systems work in a reliable manner. The business changes, and as the business changes, so also will our needs as far as resource utilization, resource acquisition, and resource management. We want to ensure that our systems have the correct level of capacity in CPU processing, network, bandwidth, for example, that we'll be able to meet both current and future business needs. A very easy way to see this, for example, is to look at power. When we deal with power, we need to make sure that we have adequate amounts of backup power in order to ensure that even if we had a power failure, our systems would still be able to continue to operate, or at least we'd have the capacity through our backup uninterruptible power supplies and generators to be able to shut down non-critical systems in a graceful manner. So the audit program we develop must address all of these requirements. In order to perform an audit, we may use a variety of different automated tools, such as log analysis tools that will look through the vast amount of data we have in our logs. We want to ensure that when we examine our logs, we can extract those items that are of most value to us in the performance of the audit. This often means filtering out a lot of noise or a lot of data that was not required. We will also often use specialized software, Specialized software will allow us to test the parameter settings of a system, for example. Is it correctly configured? Is this system then being operated and managed in a way that will support then our security needs? This is where we'll bring in terms we'll look at later in this course, such as then the monitoring, the actual then ensuring that we've hardened our systems adequately, that we've turned off unnecessary ports, protocols, and services. It is also useful for an auditor to do flowcharting, to look at how a process works, to follow data in a transaction through the department, to see the various routes that data can take, and ensure that we have resolved all types of decisions properly. And flowcharting can be a very good tool the auditor can use in getting a logical understanding of the actual business process. The auditor will often also check what documents are available for review. This could be anything from policy documents to then procedural documents, to examine how the business had anticipated a process should work. As we often know, the way that things are being done can be significantly different from how they were documented. The auditor should examine the documents to see what was the intended methodology, and if there is a variation from that, try to determine why there is that variance. Should the documents then be updated, or is it such that we need to push the organization more to compliance with the documented procedures? A lot of the evidence and information we gather during an audit will be through inquiry and observation, interviews, and watching how the process works. We could also follow a transaction step by step through an operation. We could call this a walkthrough. When we're looking at an IT system, quite often we'll do both static and dynamic testing, where we'll test how a process flows through the organization in a normal way, as well as with dynamic testing, test the variations, the error conditions, and even inject errors into the process to ensure that those are handled correctly by the system. We can also test our controls, make sure that we test their performance and follow then a transaction that has gone through to ensure that bad traffic is blocked and certainly good traffic is permitted. These all make up the testing process that we should document as part of then our audit plan and strategy. Fraud detection. One of the things that's important is that we should always be aware of the chance of fraud or irregularities. In the end, management is responsible for the design, establish, and operation of controls. This means, of course, that management should have put in place controls that could deter fraud, could detect fraud, and, of course, prevent fraud. Controls in this case could be dual control, separation of duties, other types of both technical and administrative controls that were put in place. In the end, the responsibility to prevent fraud is the obligation of management. However, as auditors, we often are going to be used to try to ensure that these anti-fraud controls are working. We will try to ensure that personnel have not been then bypassing the various anti-fraud controls that are there. For example, taking shortcuts. We also have the problem of collusion. Collusion is when we have separation of duties in theory, but the two people that are working on this work together to then circumvent, either intentionally or accidentally, the controls that were put in place. In the case of an intentional collusion, is where the two people agree to try to defraud the organization by working together. Accidental is where they are being slack, and the one person who is responsible then for the review and approval of a process doesn't pay attention and therefore doesn't detect the fraud when it actually did occur. Whenever we do an audit, we should be especially alert to the possible opportunities for fraud. We should watch for fraud and, of course, any other type of irregularities in any case. We must report any instance of fraud to management so that action can be taken appropriately in that regard. A lot of the work we do in audit is going to be based on what we call evidence. Now, evidence itself is information we have gathered and analyzed. In other words, information we have used to support then our audit conclusions. However, there's always a risk when it comes to evidence. Is that evidence reliable? There's many things, of course, that could influence the reliability or trustworthiness of the evidence that has been presented to us. We gather evidence from many different sources. For example, from notes, interviews, and other types of corroborating information, where we, for example, have witnessed something and then follow up to see how that process actually happened. We'll gather evidence by reviewing documentation, which could be anything from incident reports, business continuity plan tests, documentation such as policies and procedures, or other types of documentation that was used, for example, in the sign-off and approval of a process. We'll also gather evidence through the various tests that we can conduct. The results of those audit tests provide evidence which is often needed for us to then back up or justify our findings and, of course, conclusions. The trustworthiness of evidence is important, however. There is always the risk that the auditor will have been misled by evidence that has not then been properly validated. As we saw earlier on, it is important that an auditor always has a certain level of professional skepticism. In many cases, when evidence has been presented orally, the auditor will want to see that backed up with paper to make sure that that evidence truly was trustworthy. We have to consider the timing of the evidence. Is this evidence something that has been received in a timely manner? And are we gathering the information in a way that will allow us to take action in a way before the situation gets worse? We also have to look at the objectivity of the evidence versus the subjectivity. Subjectivity is evidence which is based on opinion or a person's personal judgment, where objective evidence is usually more measurable. It's evidence which can be measured against a statistic, for example. We also have to examine the qualifications of the person providing the evidence. Are they competent to provide then that information that they are providing to us? For example, if this is an opinion of someone who is not really qualified or knowledgeable in the area, there's a very good reason to suspect the evidence then being provided is not really valid. The other issue is the independence of the provider of the evidence. For example, if the person who is presenting this evidence to us has been involved in the process themselves, they may be tempted to have altered or misrepresented the evidence. If the person who is presenting the evidence has a grudge or a dispute with another person, it could be the evidence we receive has been tainted or biased by that prejudicial attitude that the provider then has. As an auditor, we have the obligation to ensure the evidence we have received is trustworthy and valid. So how do we do all of this evidence gathering? We review the organizational structure, including examining the policies and procedures used by the organization. We review IS and information system standards to make sure is our system operating according to globally recognized best practices. We review the documentation of the system to see whether or not the system is being operated in accord with its authorization, in accord with its then intended purpose, and therefore has the configuration and operation of the system been then managed appropriately. There's a lot we can learn from interviewing the people that work with the system every day. Doing an interview with appropriate personnel would be to interview then users who will be familiar with the problems and challenges of using the system, to interview the administrators who then will know what sort of breaches or problems have happened in the past, to interview management who can give us the perspective on the value of this system and its strategic importance to the organization. But very often an interview is not precise. People may even tell us what they think we want to hear. So it's always good to back up an interview through observation of the actual processes and employees, to ensure that the employees are then following the processes that they claimed during the interview. We can re-perform certain activities to see how those activities actually do operate through the system. And it's good for us to do walkthroughs as a part of our audit plan to watch how a process or transaction flows through the systems. How does it flow from various, systems, departments, reports, personnel, and are those controls that were put in place effective to ensure we do not have a breach of the confidentiality, integrity, or availability of that transaction. Through all of this, we gather the evidence that is going to be necessary for us then to provide a thorough and complete, audit finding. When we look at the observation of personnel, this very much can help us as auditors to evaluate the actual functions of who does do what activity. So we understand the relationships and we understand the dependencies between personnel and departments. We then also can get an understanding of the actual process. What happens when a process follows its natural or normal flow as compared to when a process follows some type of error handling or something which is outside of the normal flow? We want to ensure that the process itself is compliant with both the documented, procedures, but also compliant with the intent of the policies and procedures. So as auditors, by watching the process, we can ensure that that process is operating in a stable, robust, resilient, and repeatable manner every single time. We also want to gauge what is the security awareness of the various stakeholders that are involved in the operation of the system. These could be system administrators, developers, business analysts, the users, the IT support staff, and we want to ensure that each one of those entities is aware of what security controls we've put in place, and they are aware of their personal obligation then to follow those controls and to be compliant with the various policies and procedures we have. We will examine the reporting relationships to ensure that we do not have a conflict of interest and to ensure that there is an opportunity to prevent fraud through things such as separation of duties. We also want to measure the actual technical competence or skill of the people that manage our systems on a daily basis. Do they have the appropriate level of training? Do they have the awareness? Do they have in place the procedures that are being followed consistently to ensure that our systems are being operated in a technically sound and secure manner?